Let me first of all compliment my friend and colleague, the senator from Kansas, for his comments and for his approach. He made a few comments there that we haven't heard enough of in this chamber or in the other chamber in the last few days. That he said that before he was a Democrat or before he was a Republican, he was an American. And I want to compliment him on those sentiments, and I want to rise in that same vein, because whether you're somebody from Kansas or somebody from North Carolina, or I can tell you folks I hear from Virginia, they keep saying to me, why can't you guys get this thing done? Why can't you both be willing to give a little to put our country first? I never thought I'd say, as somebody who had the honor of serving as governor of Virginia and somebody who was a business guy for 20 years, I never thought I'd be standing on the floor of the Senate 6 days, 5.5 days away from the United States of America potentially defaulting on our obligations. And yet, most of the debate, Lord knows almost all of the press conferences, have less been about solutions and more been about who's to blame. Yet whether you're folks in the gallery or you're people watching at home, or like most Americans trying to get through an unbearably hot summer, you wonder, who are these folks that we hired to get the people's business done? You know, I have been involved with a group of senators, and I want to, over the last 9 months, that have done something that I didn't think was extraordinary, but unfortunately in today's day in life is pretty extraordinary. A group of Democratic and Republican senators who've said the most important issue we face in our country is to try to get our debt and deficit under control, and who've said the only way that we can get that under control is to sit together for hours on end, reason together, argue, do something as perhaps, I think, basically American as compromise. And after months and months of back and forth, and then last Tuesday when we revealed that so-called plan, which frankly, the Gang of Six, which was built upon the work of a previous year work of Democrats and Republicans and independents and business leaders, the President's Deficit Commission, a remarkable thing happened for a couple of days in this body. Instead of everybody coming out and saying why this couldn't happen, they said, hey, it isn't perfect, but this actually would lower our deficit by close to $4 trillion. Take on tax reform, take on entitlement reform, cut spending, and might just be a path out. Well, that lasted a couple days, and then we got back to who was going to score points in the next 24-hour news cycle. Well, I desperately hope and pray that at this moment in our country that we will rise to the task and make sure that with the eyes not of the nation but of the world on us, that we do our basic job, which makes sure the United States of America doesn't default next Tuesday. The only way I think we're going to get there is if we lower the rhetoric, lower the finger pointing, recognize it's going to take ideas from both sides. But it is going to take a change in attitude from some. There was a congressman who gave a press conference sometime in the last day or two who paraphrased Winston Churchill. He said, we're going to fight you on the beaches, we're going to fight you at sea, we're going to fight you in the air to make structural changes to the way the place known as Washington, D.C. operates. Who's the you he's going to fight? He's going to fight people who say that maybe America and Americans want us to actually work together and compromise? I mean, this kind of sentiment goes beyond the pale at a moment when our nation's at this kind of crisis. There's been a lot of talk recently, particularly coming from the other body, about, well, the only way to solve this problem is an amendment, a constitutional amendment. Well, I'd point out 49 states have that kind of amendment. So you got to balance your books. My state, Virginia, the presiding officer state, North Carolina, meets that goal. There are an awful lot of states that have got that kind of amendment in place. And I don't know what kind of accounting they use, but I've not heard many folks point to California's state budget and say that's a balanced budget. So some kind of process argument here isn't going to solve the problem. We got to make the hard choices. We got to cut spending. We got to reform our entitlements. We got to reform our tax code to generate additional revenues. The numbers don't lie. We're spending at an all-time high, 25% of our GDP. We're collecting revenues at a historic low, 15% of GDP. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that any time our nation's budget has been in relative balance, it's been when we've been roughly between spending and revenues between 19.5% and 20.5%. Why can't we come together to put a plan in place that does that? Folks who are watching say, well, there actually is a plan that more than a third of the Senate has said, hey, yeah, we'll be with you, about an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. But instead, we're going back and forth, ping pong, who's going to have which plan, who's going to win each day. It's also pretty remarkable at this moment in time, and I don't know who this congressman is or what his particular issue is, but when you've got roughly a fifth of the House who at least say they're on record that they will never vote to increase the debt limit. I wonder when they took the oath to uphold the laws of our country, which said we got to pay our bills, how that commitment matches with those promises or those political positions. My sense is if they want to have an amendment to the Constitution, what they are advocating, this we will never change our way or the highway approach, the amendment they ought to be talking about is basically restructuring our whole Constitution and turning our government into a parliamentary system. There are a lot of places around that if you win an election, you get to choose the chief executive, you get to control the legislature, you can pass anything you want. Yet these very same folks are the ones who say we want to support our Constitution. Well, the Constitution and the genius of our Constitution was the fact that the founders said the most basic American principle was checks and balances. You got a House, you got a Senate, you got a president, and actually they got to work together. And somehow the attitude, again, of some of these members in the House, which is our way or let's drive our country over the cliff, is as dramatically un-American as anything I've ever seen. And at the same time, we hear other members who say, well, maybe we just need a little more economic shock to make us do the right thing. What are these folks thinking of? Stock market closed down 200 points today. It's been down about 400 points this week. It's an awful lot of Americans who only now are starting to recover from the financial crisis of 2 years ago. Awful lot of retirees who saw their 401ks plummet 2 years ago that slowly have seen that nest egg that's going to get them through retirement or get them through rough times recover. We're down 400 points. How much more stock market decline do we need before we all have the cover to do the right thing? 1,000 points? Do we need to put another 1 million Americans out of work? Do we need to throw more people out of their homes because of the tax increase that will result, the real increase that will result with the rise in interest rates that will happen next week? And there are others who say, well, let's just do short term. Let's kick the can down for a short while. Something that's being discussed in the House. It doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. It matters because that approach will result in a lowering of our debt rating. I know people get eyes glaze over when you hear about debt ratings. Unfortunately, debt ratings, and we are the only countries in the world with a AAA debt rating. That means we are kind of the gold standard. Well, if we have that debt rating reduced, it's not only a black eye for America. Not only means that what we have to pay in interest rates will go up, not just for government, but if you've got a school bond, if you've got a state bond, those prices are going to go up. You got an auto loan, you got a home mortgage, you got a student loan, you're a business trying to expand your business, the cost of that are all going to go up. The very same folks who say, well, we will never look at more revenues, don't seem to mind at all that if we have to have an interest rate rise because of a default or a downgrade of our debt, doesn't that take more money out of our Americans' pockets? I just don't get it. So I do hope, and frankly, as the presiding officer knows, I've been pretty obsessed about this issue for months on end. I do hope that we will check our Democrat and Republican hats. I echo what my colleague, the senator from Kansas, said. And recognize when we get out of bed tomorrow morning, we get out of bed as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans first. That we not only get over the debt limit, which hopefully through some convoluted process we will, but that we also recognize that getting past August 2nd doesn't mean, okay, we're done, everybody go have a nice August. All that does is buy us a bit of time to decide whether we're going to come back to the really hard issues of not only how we start with some spending cuts, which will be part of our down payment, but how we really make sure that the entitlement programs, so many of us on both sides of the aisle, but particularly on this side of the aisle, want to protect, that they're actually there 10, 20, 30 years from now. The notion that they're not going to change, cannot be continued to be sustainable on a current rate, it's not Democrat or Republican, it's just the fact that, thank goodness, a lot of us are living a lot longer. And the facts remain. When I was a kid, there were 16, 17 people paying in for every one Social Security retiree. Now there are 3. We got to make sure my kids, your kids, that there is Social Security here in its framework. At the same time, we've got to have our colleagues on the Republican side recognize that you've got to reform our tax code in a way that makes it simpler, flatter, and yes, generate some additional revenue. The only way we're going to get there, if and when we get past this August 2nd date, is if we combine that effort with a long-term debt reduction plan. I am more than open to any valid, balanced, comprehensive, bipartisan plan that's around. The effort that the so-called Gang of Six or the third of the Senate that said, hey, yeah, this is worth considering, isn't perfect, I can assure you. Some will even say some of the descriptions I've made, it might not meet all those, but I tell you 3 things it is. It's comprehensive, it's bipartisan, and under any analysis, it does what our country desperately needs. Starts to drive our debt to GDP ratio, which is a fancy way of saying, can we maintain our books on a path to lead to fiscal stability? And frankly, what that would also allow us to do is get back to what we should be spending our time on here, which is creating growth in this economy. Start unleashing American creativity and innovation again. But that's not going to happen if we spend all our time pointing back and forth about how we got here or which short-term plan best meets the short-term interests of the next 5 or 6 days. I, for one, believe the plan that Senator Reid's laid out is not perfect, but it gives us the time to deal with this debt and deficit problem in a serious way. It gives us the ability not to to ensure that we don't have a debt downgrade. The plan that's being unfortunately debated in the House right now, it may have some merits. But the one thing that is clear is that it will lead to a downgrade. Not my word, but all the rating agencies, whether we like them or not, they're the folks who set that standard. So I would urge again, the folks who are making statements that say we're going to fight you on the beaches, we're going to fight you at sea, we're going to fight you in the air, to use your fellow Americans here. And if you don't like our system of government, then be honest and propose a change to a parliamentary system. If you do honor and respect the Constitution, which we all took an oath to uphold, recognize that that is a Constitution that puts in place checks and balances to have us all work, give a little, and recognize that when we get out of bed in the morning, we're not a Democrat or Republican, but an American first and foremost. So, Mr. President, I hope and pray that we will find the path through these next 5 days, that we won't do the unthinkable. I've said on a couple stations, I'm sure it'll come back and bite me, that, we don't do this, we should all get fired. Because the fact is, the most basic promise we make is to uphold the laws and rules of our country. And frankly, I can't think of anything that's more quintessentially American than making sure you pay your bills and you honor your obligations. So let's get that done, and then let's work together to make sure that we put in plan the long-term, comprehensive, bipartisan approach that's needed so that we can get this nation back on the right fiscal path, but more importantly, back on the right path to ensure that everybody gets that fair shot and that economic growth that we all seek so much. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.